Do monarchies still matter? In Britain, 4 days to celebrate 70 years of the world's longest reign. It's a very different United Kingdom from the one where Queen Elizabeth first saw the light of day in 1926. What's the Platinum Jubilee about in post-Brexit Britain? Why do crowned heads still abound throughout Europe in this, the 21st century? Is the embodiment of a nation's power best represented by a hereditary head of state or an elected president? The thrill may be gone in some parts of the Commonwealth, but the aura endures when it comes to Elizabeth. Even here in Republican France, where the rivalries run ever since a Normand crossed the Channel in 1066, and where royal heads have rolled in the past, the state paying its respects to Elizabeth Regina, a nod to neighbours whose fate will always be intertwined, or perhaps a farewell to a soon bygone era. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the longest reign, and joining us from London is France 24 correspondent Bénédicte Paviot. Bénédicte, it's only just beginning where you are.
Yes, this is day one. We have 4 days, and so today, normally being Thursday, in the United Kingdom, that would be a working day. It is not. It is a bank holiday, and that has been done specially. Tomorrow, Friday, is a bank holiday, and then we've got the weekend. And a real signal, pubs are closing late. They'll be open till 1 a.m. so that the country can party on into the night with the liquids that they wish to ingest.
You've clearly not at the destination where you're supposed to be, because I can see blue skies behind you, so it must not be London. Laura Carter is with us as well, lecturer in British history. You'll tell us if that sunshine is a first for a jubilee. Thank you very much for being with us. You're at the Université Paris-Cité. Thanks for joining us. Jeremy Stubbs, president of British Conservatives in Paris. How are you?
Very well, thanks. And you?
All right, I'm okay.
Great.
And from the UK capital, Rosa Friedman, professor in law and global development at the University of Reading. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation, and you have on Facebook and Twitter, #F24debate. Steady at the helm, flanked by her heirs, the Queen coming out on the balcony of Buckingham Palace in one of those highlights of the Jubilee. Joe McGuinn has more.
After 70 years as Britain's head of state, Queen Elizabeth II appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace to jubilant crowds to mark the occasion. The rest of the family came out alongside Her Majesty to witness a display of 15 Typhoon jets spelling out the number 70 in the sky. The renowned Red Arrows would later add to the spectacle, along with scores of other aircraft. Some notable balcony absentees were Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, along with Prince Andrew, forced to quit royal duties over his friendship with sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. Earlier in the day, large crowds arrived early on the Mall trying to get a glimpse of the action, some even sleeping there overnight.
The atmosphere is tremendous. You do feel tired, you have to fight to stay awake, but I stayed awake all night.
So I live close by, but I've never actually seen the Queen before, so this is an opportunity. I thought I'd come. There's so many people and they're all cheering, and yeah, it's really great.
The Queen's Irish Guards were given the task of trooping the colour, with Prince Charles taking his final birthday salute on behalf of his mother. The Duchess of Cambridge and Cornwall made their way towards Buckingham Palace riding a carriage. After the celebrations, gun salutes rang out across the country, marking a difficult year for the monarch, who has been suffering from health problems. After seeing 14 different prime ministers, no British monarch has ever reigned for so long.
So, Bénédicte Paviot, plenty of pageantry for this Platinum Jubilee. And as we heard in that report, many showing up bright and early.
Oh yeah, I came here 2 days ago to do a recce, and I met a woman from Bernadette from Canada who'd flown over, and therefore who was starting to sleep here to bag that prime position very near Buckingham Palace, where she would get that front row seat, like actually France 24 viewers have had with our reports today. And she was prepared unlike our viewers, to have to sleep here. And it was quite cold on one of the nights, and I think it even rained. So that is dedication. But I've met also over the years, for example, great lovers of Diana and of royalty who interviewed them, asked them what motivates them, and they worship some members of the royal family. And for some people, yeah, they worship the Queen. Now, although the Queen is extremely popular and highly respected, the majority of the British population, well, certainly anybody under 70, has never known anybody else at the head of on the British throne. I thought I would do something, Francois, very quickly with you, which I haven't done all day yet. I thought I would treat our viewers to seeing some of the merchandising. So there we go, the Buckingham Palace bag. You can get them in blue if anybody would like to know. And I thought we would look at some of the Jubilee merchandising. And I thought I would treat us to looking at a Jubilee cake for that 70-year reign. And as you can see, it is untouched as we speak, but perhaps later we might just tuck into it with the rest of the crew.
Well, you can tuck into it. You can just expense it to the office. That's no problem. Let me ask you, because there's a lot to unpack there, Laura Carter. First off, listening to Benedict, is it about Britain? Is it about the British royal family, or is it about the longevity of this particular monarch?
I think on this Jubilee, it's really the Queen that matters, perhaps more than the monarchy. As your correspondent said, many people have known no other monarch except for Queen Elizabeth II. There's a lot of conversation at this Jubilee around her values and the things that she embodies, rather than a focus on the institution and potentially the different parts of the institution that one could critique. So I think we're hearing a lot about her service, her duty, her integrity.
So maybe we asked the wrong question on the hashtag F24 debate, because the question we asked was, do monarchies matter? And there were some who say yes. There were others one person, I think being a little glib, who said, sure they do. People love dinosaurs.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think people like tradition in Britain. I think we can certainly say that tradition, that circumstance, and having a few days off work, that's kind of a bit of a magical combination, especially after COVID and after the kind of ups and downs of Brexit. So I would say the Queen is always going to be, this Queen is always going to be something to celebrate, and she's a pretty uncontroversial figure. The monarchy, I think, is more of an ambivalent topic.
Right, but the Queen herself is not a controversial figure. Rosa Friedman, is this a celebration you subscribe to?
I mean, we can celebrate the fact that here we have a monarch that has reigned for this long, the longest time that a monarch has reigned for. But at the same time, what is a monarch? Why is it that we're celebrating a figurehead in a country where we have such inequality, where we have 2.5 million people relying on food banks, where we have almost a quarter of children living in extreme poverty? So yes, we can celebrate this as a kind of figurehead celebration from a Commonwealth perspective, or from a perspective of people that want to think that monarchies matter. But from a point of view of human rights, absolutely not at all. This is not a celebration.
And what about those people who were speaking to Bénédicte Paviot earlier and who revere the Queen and revere the royal family? Why is that?
I mean, I think there is something to be said that we're coming out of a global pandemic, all of us, and we're all looking for something to celebrate. We're all looking for a way in which to engage with our neighbours, with our friends, with our society and our communities. But I don't think that there are that many people in the UK that celebrate the monarchy. And actually what we're seeing is a huge amount of tourism, and particularly from France, of people coming in to celebrate our monarch, rather than the people in this country thinking that our tax money ought to be going to be paying for this institution, particularly given what's happened, as you said earlier on, in terms of Prince Andrew, but also the many other terrible things that this institution has embodied over recent years and decades.
Jeremy Stubbs?
Well, I think I'd rather live in a monarchy than in a dreary anarcho-syndicalist commune that other people might prefer. I don't think that if you abolished the monarchy tomorrow, you would thereby abolish poverty in the country or that all the other wealthy people would suddenly either give their money away or lose it. People here are obviously very enthusiastic, not simply about the person of the Queen. I mean, she could have been a very, very successful nurse, for example. What they like, though, is that she represents something that means a lot to them, something about the country, something about the nation. She embodies that nation, and that is a very, very good thing, I think.
It's a very good thing. Isn't it better, I'll play devil's advocate here, if you have a head of state who's boring? Like the president of Germany and the president of Italy. Isn't that better for democracy than a head of state who's also the head of the church, who gets their legitimacy from their heritage?
Let me give you a very, very technical answer, which is that there's boring and there's boring. The Queen is in some ways, you know, she's not a sort of a wisecracking, amusing individual. Her words are very measured. She doesn't say extraordinary things. And yet that little bit of what she does say has a great impact, especially in charitable circles. You quote the president of Germany. Nobody knew who on earth he was outside Germany until his entry to Ukraine was discouraged. You there have somebody who's not simply boring, but who is just sort of non-existent. There is none of the, let's face it, the ceremony of state that really captures and inspires people's imagination.
Laura Carter, what are your students think?
Let me step in here for a minute.
Rosa Friedman, go ahead.
The Queen has stepped up, and admirably, she's stepped up and been part of the cultural boycott on Russia. And let's talk about Ukraine for a minute, because that's the most important thing that I think any of us can talk about in Europe right now. Our Queen has stepped up. Germany has not stepped up. Germany, in terms of monarchy or in terms of a republic, it doesn't matter. Germany is not stepping up to stop a war, whereas our Queen has done. And she has done not only on this war, but on many other wars over her reign. She has embodied peace and stability for our nation, but also for Europe, and also hopefully for the Commonwealth and the rest of the world. But the problem is what happens after her reign. And I think that she knows this also, that after her reign, this idea of a monarchy, that she's given birth to these children, none of whom, I think, embody what she does, will go forward, is a nonsense. What we really need in this world are people who can step up, who understand human rights, who understand peace and stability in the universe, and who can actually embody it going forward. And I don't see that in Prince Charles, let alone in any of his siblings, and let alone in his children. Laura
Carter?
On the question of Charles and what happens next, which I think is kind of the question that is also looming over this whole Jubilee, I wonder if perhaps Prince Charles is going to kind of step forward or try and represent himself as really an environmental campaigner. And that's really where he's been positioning himself for many years now. So he may be able to win some favor with the younger generation, perhaps, on that issue. But there remains the question of the huge amount of land, for example, that is personally owned by Prince Charles, and the money that he gains from it, which, going back to Rosa's earlier point, in a country that is facing a severe cost of living crisis and people are struggling to pay their rent, I think those two things are increasingly difficult to reconcile.
Bénédicte Paviot, we heard Rosa Friedman allude to it. One of the subtexts of this Jubilee celebration is a nation that's coming out of COVID, and it's true that, you know, when we see crowds outside Buckingham Palace, it's a nice sight to see after what we've been through, the whole world has been through the last 2 years. The other subtext is the war in Ukraine. You earlier bumped into one Ukrainian woman who came along to watch the celebrations.
Yeah, and, you know, had this Jubilee happened 2 years ago, we wouldn't have been going through the war in Ukraine. So it was such a 2022 moment. I had spoken to farmers. I had spoken to a man who'd been here when he was 11 back in 1953 at the coronation. But I think when I first spoke to this English woman, and she had 2 small children with her, and then this other woman, I could see she didn't completely understand English, and I asked this woman, and so the woman was British, and she had brought these Ukrainian refugees that she was welcoming in her home, who arrived just at the beginning of May. They're learning English. The children are already in school. They were twins. They were about 6 years old. And it was really my first encounter that directly, and it was with a Ukrainian refugee, and it was very much this woman saying, actually, my British teenagers, weren't interested and didn't want to come. They're doing their teenage thing. I'm quoting her. But she said, I wanted these guests of mine to come and experience this Britishness and this tradition and this historic moment that is unprecedented, that will never happen again. And their English is coming along really well. But there was another telling moment, François, when we had that fly past, and there were some helicopters just before that. And of course, the children got a little bit nervous, and they're learning to not be afraid of what is in the sky. And that, for me, was the chilling moment. I'm getting goosebumps as I talk about it, because that was their reality. And luckily, but for just a few Ukrainians, this is now their reality. I just wanted to come back to the Queen, and I wanted to introduce 2 words I used in one report about soft power, because it is said by one British historian, if I may, that actually the United Kingdom has 2 great soft power tools, assets. And one is the English language, the lingua franca. It is spoken all over the world. It is.
Oh dear, we seem to have lost the connection there with Bénédicte Paviot. We'll try to patch her back in a moment. I can imagine that the second one was the Queen herself, of those 2 things. Every time there's a jubilee, it's a moment in time, and of course the war in Ukraine, a reminder that the Queen herself was someone who experienced World War II and knows what war in Europe is. Each time there's a jubilee, it's a milestone for a monarch who, again, her first prime minister was Winston Churchill. The first jubilees, the silver one, 1977, the Queen already celebrated for her longevity. The PM then was James Callaghan. He was a Labour member of Parliament. Inflation then, like now, was high. There were strikes. And, one of Britain's other biggest exports at the time seemed to be defiance. The birthplace of punk rebelled to a degree against the established order as the Sex Pistols sang Anarchy in the UK. Of course, a few short years later, Jeremy Stubbs, it was Margaret Thatcher who would come to power. But 1977, when that Silver Jubilee happened, Britain was a divided place.
Well, of course, Britain is always a divided place. Like most countries, like most democracies, we're allowed to be divided, which is one of the good things, although there may be bad things. But it's interesting to see that, yes, it was a difficult time, but people did come together for that Jubilee. I have to confess I didn't myself. I was doing my adolescent thing at the time. But it's true that there was real fervour. People came out into the street, and even in an era where people had really very little, they brought and contributed to street parties in a remarkable way. I mean, rock stars and footballers who get paid huge, obscene amounts of money, they don't inspire that kind of feeling in people, that kind of common fellow feeling. And that is the secret of the Queen, and I think it'll be the secret of her successors too.
Again, each Jubilee is a snapshot.
Well, this is where I'm going to disagree with my colleague. I was born in 1983, and Margaret Thatcher was actually my local MP. Not that I could vote for her, obviously. I was born into a time and an era where there was a huge divide in the British public between the North and the South, and that same divide is now happening again. And we're talking about levelling up and bringing more money into the north of this country because of the huge divide between the North and the South. This is an era that I didn't expect to see again in my lifetime. It's an era I was born into and I did not want to be born into. The idea that the monarchy could save us maybe was something in the 1980s, during the time when Margaret Thatcher took away most of the money from this country and sold it off in many different ways, and took away our railways and everything else. But this is not where we ought to be now. And my worry is that this Queen, and she is a great Queen, and she has been absolutely fantastic at every stage and every crisis throughout the history of the 20th century, let alone the current time. My worry is that once she goes, because we all will go one day, what's going to happen next? We cannot rely on this institution to take us forward. We need to be looking to something different, and that something different cannot be the kind of elitism that we're seeing with our Prime Minister, who is part of this elitism that the monarchy embodies, where people think because they are rich or because they are coming from landed gentry that they can get away with anything and everything that they do. So we need something different and something better.
A different guarantor is what you're saying. Just a word again on these how each Jubilee is a snapshot. 2002, another Jubilee, another Labour Prime Minister. This time, though, a different sort of Labour. It was under Tony Blair. It was the period of Cool Britannia, a time of economic boom when Britain welcomed immigrants, even toyed with the notion of joining the euro. Fast forward 10 years later, and while London celebrated the hosting of both the 2012 Olympics and the Diamond Jubilee, the Conservatives this time shared the limelight. Who knew that David Cameron would go on to trigger a Brexit referendum? Laura Carter, again, one of the great things about this Queen is we get to look at the long view. As a historian, you must love that. And then when you look at each Jubilee, you think, is Britain at the same point each time when it's divisions, or is Britain like a roller coaster that goes up and down?
Well, I mean, I think divisions exist in all societies and democracies, but perhaps thinking about 1977 is a bit more instructive if we want to compare between other Jubilees and now, because of those divisions that were rampant in the 70s. I mean, very poor industrial relations around the time of the Silver Jubilee. I think James Callaghan lasted just one more year after that point, but also really high youth unemployment and this sort of feeling of no future, which is what that punk movement that the Sex Pistols were really speaking to. And I do think, today we also have some kinds of generational divides that this Jubilee is just sort of papering over the cracks of. And I think, the real question is, what happens next? Because
so you have the political fortunes that concern, and you heard Rosa Friedman's objections on that score. We're seeing it in Spain. The former king, who in a previous life stood up courageously to defend democracy when it was under threat, and returning last month from exile in the Gulf to see his son, Juan Carlos, who's in disgrace, who's been embroiled in scandal. And the question then is, again, can the same thing happen in Britain after Queen Elizabeth?
Maybe after Queen Elizabeth. I think the point is she's been this strong centre, right? And there's been this chaos around her. Prince Andrew, Charles and Diana in the 90s. And she's been that kind of constant, safe, rather neutral figure, if you want to call it like that. So, potentially that could happen. I don't think the PR machine of the firm, as it's sometimes called, would really allow that to happen. I think the question of kind of reproducing the stability of Queen Elizabeth II must be high on their agenda. But it is a well kind of polished machine and image that we are sold. I mean, look at all those products that are being sold at the Jubilee this weekend. So I think we ought not to be naive about the sorts of images we receive and where they're coming from, and the fact that they are carefully crafted.
Jeremy Stubbs, the magic of this monarchy is the person of the Queen herself?
Well, as I said before, I mean, she might have been a great nurse, and we may not be talking about her very much. She might have been given a medal by whoever was the monarch. We happen to be lucky that we have a great institution with a great person fulfilling the role. And when you look at royals, the most spendthrift and dissolute tend to be those who are furthest away from the throne. You quote the example, I think very appropriately, of Juan Carlos, who was at one stage a hero and at another stage had to, in a sense, be forced out because he became an embarrassment. But he was forced out. There is scrutiny of monarchs. They do pay the price. I think if I were to compare constitutional monarchs and elected politicians, I wouldn't say that there was any great moral superiority on the part of elected politicians. Possibly, on average, a bit less. I think my colleagues will be disappointed to see the monarchy go on in future years, but that'll give them plenty to talk about.
All right, well, it's not going on everywhere. 14 nations beyond the UK recognize the Queen as their head of state. It was 15 until last November, Barbados deciding to become a republic. The Prince of Wales on hand for the turnover for a Caribbean nation that remains for now member of the Commonwealth.
The creation of this republic offers a new beginning, but it also marks a point on a continuum, a milestone on the long road you have not only travelled, but which you have built. From the darkest days of our past and the appalling atrocity of slavery, which forever stains our history.
So Prince Charles there, recognizing the stain of slavery at that handover ceremony. Some in Barbados feel that the job is unfinished, and so long as the Queen heads the Commonwealth.
We have removed the Queen of head of state. So I don't think the Queen should continue, or her family should continue to be the head of the Commonwealth. Yes, I believe that there could be some form of linkages, but to remain as head of the Commonwealth, I think is a contradiction.
And now we're wondering, could Australia be next? Let's introduce you to Matt Thistlethwaite. That's Australia's new Assistant Minister for the Republic, named by the new cabinet. Back in 1999, Australia staged a referendum to ditch the recognizing Queen Elizabeth as their monarch. It was a referendum where voters voted no by 55%. And the new Labour government says it's not considering for now a referendum. Still, though, having this minister, and it's interesting because Queen Elizabeth, when she's born in 1926, it's the apex, basically, of the British Empire in terms of territory around the world, and it's getting smaller and smaller. So the fortunes of the Commonwealth, of the monarchy, do they mirror those of Britain?
Britain invented the Commonwealth, of course, and part of the reason the Commonwealth was brought into being in the 1930s was to preserve these cultural and trade links as more and more countries became independent. And I think actually this issue of the Commonwealth and our kind of post-colonial era is going to be one of the big issues for the monarchy in the future. We've seen Barbados becoming a republic, but also just last month, I think Indigenous groups in Canada formally asked for an apology from the monarchy for the way in which Indigenous children were treated. So, I mean, I don't think, I'm not necessarily of the position that the monarchy has to go, but I do think if it stays, it's got to seriously reckon with these culture wars that are happening around legacies of slavery and imperialism.
Did Prince Charles use the right words in that speech?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said before, I think even Prince Charles can be fairly well prepped. I mean, he's not really known for being politically correct, is he? But
Prince Charles, very.
Prince Charles is very politically correct.
Oh, yes.
Sometimes. I mean, I think we've seen sometimes where he's not thought the mics have been on and he's maybe not been quite so politically correct. But
I think actually, if we look at the Commonwealth or we look at the idea of human rights generally, we all have the right of self-determination, the right to determine who governs over us. And this idea of decolonisation but keeping a Commonwealth goes against our fundamental human rights. The idea that anyone can have an empire, any country can go out and take over another country and rule over it is absolutely abhorrent and ought to be in modern day society. But the idea of a Commonwealth where we have this sort of nations that that are subservient to a queen or to a monarch or an institution that's outside of their society goes into colonialism or imperialism. And if we are fighting against Russian imperialism in Ukraine currently, why should we not be fighting against imperialism
So Rosa,
from the UK
let me ask you
in
on
the
that
Commonwealth?
score. Let me ask you on that score, because the French countries have a club of nations kind of like the Commonwealth, only it's based around the language. It's called the francophonie. Is that would you put that in the same bag as the Commonwealth?
Oh, absolutely, and more so. I would say that France needs to pay back an awful lot of money to Haiti, to pay back the money that France demanded from Haiti for Haitians to buy their own people from France, because their people were property of France because they were slaves. So yes, I would absolutely say that this club of nations of France, Francophone countries, Anglophone countries, Commonwealths or anything else are just imperialism, and we should be fighting against these things.
Jeremy Stubbs, are these backwards-looking clubs trying to revive old empires that are no longer there?
Well, I think the reference to self-determination is right, and all of the members of the Commonwealth are there by their own choice. If they wish to leave, they can. The thing is, though, that the Queen is not there to sort of impose orders on anybody. What is useful about the Queen is that she is a kind of neutral figure. One thing I think that would be worrying is if people ceding from the Commonwealth now lost contact with each other. I mean, I think really in the face of the aggression we see in the 21st century, that of Russia, which is very highly dictatorial and ready to destroy anything in its path, other nations, one way or another, need to stick together. And I don't think that the francophonie or the Commonwealth are necessarily an obstacle as long as people want to be part of it. And at the moment, it seems quite a few do, even if some don't.
All right, and we're talking about France. France's president not to be left out for this Platinum Jubilee after offering the Queen a horse for her birthday. Emmanuel Macron attending a ceremony to celebrate the Entente between allies at the Arc de Triomphe's Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. This alongside the UK ambassador, and we were mentioning it at the outset. A lot of French people. I mean, this is the top story in France. Are you surprised at that?
Yeah, I actually think I am. And I remember around this time last year when I believe Meghan and Harry had a baby, and a few French people said to me, "Oh, have you heard about the baby?" And I didn't know what they would. I was like, "What baby? I don't even know you." And so I think the French population, especially the younger population, are engaged in consuming the royals as sort of pseudo-celebrities, especially the younger royals. And I think that's really a huge part of it. I think media has played a huge role in kind of selling Kate to us and selling Meghan to us as almost like celebrities. And, the French are not immune to that any more than the Americans are.
Bénédicte Paviot, of course, there's always that other subtext, which we've mentioned COVID, we've mentioned the war in Ukraine. There's another subtext, which is, of course, Brexit. And when you see images of Emmanuel Macron standing alongside the British ambassador, you can't help but think of it. Is that a subtext you're feeling with the French people you've bumped into at this Jubilee celebration?
No, actually, when I see Emmanuel Macron next to the British ambassador, I think of Brexit. I've been reporting on Brexit. I'm half French, half British myself. I know the problem from the inside, and I understand both countries culturally, socially, economically, politically, etc. There is no doubt that has been a very rocky journey, and it is set to get even rockier, because if Boris Johnson had his way next week, he would be introducing legislation which would, says the EU, breach the agreement, the very agreement that he negotiated, discussed and signed, because there is a border down the Irish Sea, and that is problematic. And clearly with the Sinn Féin win in Northern Ireland and the fact that basically unionists do not want to go into government with Sinn Féin, and they want changes to the Brexit deal.
Right, but that's the domestic context.
And would like it renegotiated.
How does this impact, though, when you see the French president front and center celebrating the Queen.
Well, let's not fall into the trap, and I say this as a half French, half British person, of not realizing, actually, although the tabloids and various media like to dwell on this, there is actually a lot of the two countries have in common. Not just the fact that they have permanent seats on the UN Security Council, not just the fact that in different parts of the world, whether it's the United Kingdom lending Chinooks in order to transport back then some French soldiers to Mali, whether it's different terrains, whether it's in Afghanistan, on defense, on culturally, many things, on terrorism, counter-terrorism. There are many things the two countries actually work together on. So it's a mistake to fall into just the Brexit trap. And I think it's interesting, actually, to have a French president who speaks fluent English. I mean, his English is outstanding. He can give very high-level, real-time interviews. Now, that's different. Let me come back to transition, if I may, Francois. Prince Charles has been very clear for a very long time that the monarchy needs to be reduced. It needs to be slimmed down. We know that the trip of the Cambridges, William and Kate, did not go down well in some instances in the Caribbean. But what was William's response? His response to say is, I come to listen. So he knows too that after his father, for however long he will reign, William will presumably inherit the crown at a younger age, and that will be a different world then. So your question earlier on about the different jubilees, almost looking at a country. This country in the 70 years has socially, politically changed massively. Pre-Brexit. Now we've had Brexit and we've had the pandemic, and you're quite right. This has traumatized a lot of people. There is fuel poverty. There is food poverty. People are having to choose between heating and eating. So that may sound domestic, but I suggest that because of the war in Ukraine, this is not just hitting the UK, it's hitting a lot of other countries. So the monarchy's in transition. Charles knows that, William knows that. The country is in transition. It might even have a new prime minister by the autumn.
You mentioned Benedict, an English-speaking French president, and how much the two nations have in common. Well, you could also say, linguists will say that 60% of the English language comes from French, and the royals have always had a soft spot for France and its lingua franca, like at this state dinner back in 1992.
La tradition anglo-saxonne est un peu à la tradition latine en Europe. Ce que l'huile est au vinaigre. Il faut les deux pour faire la sauce. Sinon, la salade est mal assaisonnée.
Thank you, Declan.
Again, Jeremy Stubbs, it's this monarch that Emmanuel Macron is paying tribute to. And she's a lover of France. And you've got to wonder, will that always be the case? I know Prince Charles also speaks French, by the way.
Yes. No, I think it's part of the tradition. It's part of the tradition, and it's very good to see that at a moment when the relationships between the two elected politicians, the two elected leaders in our two countries are so bad that the head of state, because Emmanuel Macron is also head of state, can talk to his fellow head of state in such a cordial way. I know that we have lots of things in common, so there's never any risk about the relationship, but it is nice to be reminded of that, especially at a time when, as we've said before, we all need to pull together on the international scene.
All right, the Jubilee, which is drawing in attention from both sides of the channel. There's Jubilee memorabilia, as shown by Bénédicte Paviot. There's also Jubilee food. And what's more regal than that very British specialty, coronation chicken, even if it takes a Frenchman to explain why.
In 1935, at the silver Jubilee of the King George V, there was already a kind of recipe which was just mayonnaise and curry and chicken. But in 1953, obviously Rosemary Hume and her students developed the idea and make it much more refined.
What's your religion when it comes to coronation chicken, Laura Carter?
I'm open to it.
Okay.
I'm open to
You're an
it.
open-minded person.
Yeah.
And for dessert, depends who you ask. In Republican broadsheet The Guardian, columnist Tim Dowling offers shortcuts for making Jubilee trifle. It looks quite painstaking. He says, I might have gotten similar results if I'd just thrown my shopping bag down a flight of stairs and then tipped the contents into a bowl, but I doubt the Queen would approve. Rosa Friedman, I got to ask you, not if you're making Jubilee trifle, but, these 4 days, what do they mean to you?
I mean, these 4 days mean absolutely nothing to me. We've got a war in Ukraine where 100 Ukrainian soldiers are being killed every day. 500 Ukrainian soldiers are being wounded, seriously wounded every day. Women are being raped. Children are being trafficked. We've got huge human rights abuses going on in Afghanistan, in Syria, let alone in Mali, let alone in Congo and all around the world. And for me, the focus on the Queen, while it's very nice to have some bunting out and flying in the wind and all sorts of street parties, it's just taking away from what we ought to be doing as a nation, as a society. We should be fighting climate change. We should be fighting human rights abuses. We should not be celebrating someone being born into the right family. And yes, this Queen is a great Queen, but I don't think that any of her children or grandchildren will be great in this same way. I think we should be out there working out how we can help feed people in times of famine and not how we can fly bunting in the wind.
Jeremy Stubbs?
Well, I agree in certain ways, but I don't think we'll be able to fight effectively our enemies unless we're able to come together and unless we know why we're fighting. And this weekend, I think we'll be discovering that. And I hope indeed, as we heard from your correspondent in London, that Ukrainians will be, those who are in Britain will be welcomed and made to feel part of this and made to feel part of the same sort of democracy will be restored in their country, in those parts of it that have been invaded and crushed by the Russians one day. And Britain will be there by their side.
Let me just step in for 1 minute. I really agree with that, and Britain is standing up and speaking out and supplying weapons to the Ukrainians to fight Russian imperialism. I would hope that Emmanuel Macron will stand up and do the same thing and stop supplying rubles to Russians for gas and oil, because at the moment, this is the biggest issue in Europe, is not around royalty or around a Jubilee, but around Russia and around Germany and France not supplying more money to help Russia to commit these atrocities and war crimes against Ukrainians.
And we're going to be devoting, and we have been devoting a lot of attention to what's being done on that score. Just briefly before we go, Bénédicte Paviot, of course, it's 4 days, not 1 day. What else is on the agenda?
Tonight, the lighting of beacons across the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. Tomorrow, a service of thanksgiving with the Queen at St Paul's Cathedral. But let's remember the breaking news that her second son, Prince Andrew, has tested positive with COVID. So that was to be his only appearance there. He will not, therefore, be there. Other royals will, and it'll be a special moment in the nation's remembrance and thanking, reflecting on what the Queen's accomplished. On Saturday, Epsom Derby, I understand the Queen possibly won't be there. Of course, we all know her love of horses, but other royals will be there. A BBC party just up near Buckingham Palace, not one stage like 10 years ago for the Diamond Jubilee, but 3 stages. Diana Ross, Duran Duran, Sir Elton John and many others. Alicia Keys will be singing live. And then there'll be at the end Ed Sheeran with a choir singing the national anthem. And I think possibly Prince Charles thanking publicly his mother for her life of service. And then on Sunday, Jubilee lunches across the country and people being encouraged to get together, communities. That is something the Queen is very, very keen on. And I think throughout the pandemic, her messages, as was outlined, I think, by one of your guests, have really got the mood. She doesn't speak often like that, in fact, very infrequently, but she judged the mood right. And there is huge respect for the individual. But yes, there are big questions about the future of this British monarchy. And I leave you with one other piece of merchandise, which is a coin, a commemorative coin in this box. So yes, they're very good at merchandising too, but let's remember the soft power element, and some people would like to see them as celebrities, and that is, I think, one of the things they're trying to, the monarchy are trying to fight off. They're still trying to keep some mystique in this age where everybody has an iPhone and all kinds of devices. It's difficult to be a normal person, but Prince William is doing that a lot. Let's remember Catherine Middleton was what is called often here a commoner. She did not come from aristocracy, and he and she, like very much, they want to try and keep that privacy. So a little note, that is why she photographs the children, and she, Catherine, she's a good photographer, gives those photos. That is their trade-off. It's not the British press that gets to do it. And it's good to talk about monarchy and its future and question what it stands for, what it stood for, and what it will stand for in the future. And yeah, that's what we do on France 24. We ask questions. We try to get answers. Hopefully, we've all helped a bit tonight.
All right, more questions, including about Jubilee trifle. But I want to thank you so much, Laura Carter, for being with us. I want to thank as well Jeremy Stubbs, Rosa Friedman, and Bénédicte Paviot from London. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.